Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Hello again, how are you? I hope you're well. My name is Martin Ballard and I'd like to welcome you to episode 34 of this podcast series from one of the biggest producers of pantomime and children's theatre across the UK.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
Now, I hope you've been listening to all of our previous episodes, but if you haven't, where have you been? A quick reminder, though, that if you have missed any of the conversations with creatives, actors, or behind-the-scenes tours at Imagine Theatre, you can catch up with them at any time. Every single one of them is still available. And in the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to the series so that you don't miss out on any future episodes. Now, in episode 33, I was at the De Montfort Hall in Leicester, celebrating the return of children to pantomimes this Christmas, when I went behind the scenes to find out what happens at Imagine's junior ensemble auditions. This time, I'm delighted to say I've been joined by the theatre director, academic and trustee of the UK Pantomime Association, Rob Marsden. How are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you, Martin.
Now, you've had a really busy year and there's an awful lot of stuff that you've done. I want to concentrate on all of the stuff that relates to panto. So we have to start, really, last Christmas. Just explain the experience, because I know that you've got a doctorate in the rehearsal room practices and so on, but you surely have never come across anything quite like that.
I haven't, Martin, and yes, I may have got my doctorate and I may have written a book on rehearsal room practices, but actually when there is an unprecedented situation like a global pandemic, we have to evolve our practices accordingly. And during the pandemic, and pantomime in particular, obviously we were still dealing with several restrictions. We were dealing with surging cases. And for me, what was happening in the rehearsal room was twofold. One is in terms of what we were rehearsing on the floor, but also how we were rehearsing. And the how was really interesting. That Imagine were brilliant at putting in a lot of support for practitioners, for creative teams and so on, because a lot of people hadn't been in the rehearsal room for 18 months, 2 years. I'd done a project in the summer, which was on and off, which had a lot of residual stress with that. But a lot of people hadn't been in the room and were concerned with rising cases, concerned with lives and their families. So for me, compassion and kindness was at the fore more so than absolutely ever before. Checking in with people, making sure that the rehearsal room was as stress-free as possible. Rehearsal rooms, as you know, particularly for pantomime, you've got a couple of weeks to get on a big show with West End standards. So how do you do that, which is already a pressurised environment, with even more care for individual needs? In the second week, as it were, we're coming out of the rehearsal room, we were doing a run and then back into tech. We were very much in three bubbles, so the creative team were in one bubble, the actors were in another, and the technical staff of the theatre were in another. So we're trying to minimise that risk as much as possible, still trying to communicate with each other, still trying to make it as collaborative as possible, working through different mediums, maybe through WhatsApp groups to have conversations with people backstage and so on and so forth. So we were finding different ways of communicating to still keep it collaborative within those three bubbles. But yeah, in the rehearsal room, making sure people's expectations and wishes were recognised and honoured. So if people were really concerned about personal space and space, we were able to do that. Making sure that if people, the residual stress of people in their home lives, when families were potentially being affected by COVID, and people were worried about Christmas and seeing families at Christmas, and just checking in, giving people a bit of time, maybe a little bit of extra of a break just to make those phone calls and so on and so forth. So we were really considering day to day almost what people needed, that kind of theory of need, as it were. What do we really need in order for us to work as comfortably, effectively and as creatively and collaboratively as we could?
And I think everybody agreed that the protocols were in place for good reason, and it felt more comfortable and safe. It was a safe environment, which is really important. But nevertheless, that brought its own challenges, and that really is a tribute to everybody in the industry and everybody in the rehearsal rooms up and down the country who were so flexible, weren't they?
Really flexible. And I think because creativity runs through everybody's bones, we were just creative in how we work within the rules and regulations and protocols. As you say, they were there for a reason. They were there to continue to make work. people in that room, they want to make work, they want to be putting that piece of theatre on, and so we'll work accordingly. Obviously, it was very different last year. We had fewer in the cast. We didn't have the junior ensemble, so that was a very different move, and therefore the storytelling became very, very different because we didn't have that junior ensemble. I remember talking to Eric at Imagine, the artistic director, and Callum and so forth, talking around, well, we're going to change the types of choices of music that we do, because when you have that big ensemble, sometimes you can have some much more kind of bolder song choices in relation to, okay, now we bring on the junior ensemble who will then lift that kind of dance storytelling and so on. But actually we didn't have any of that. So we did more kind of storytelling opening number than we had done in previous years. So we adapted accordingly that way as well.
It was definitely a challenging season, but nevertheless great to see Panto back after the COVID-19 lockdowns. The fact that the shows went on at all is a great tribute in itself to the covers, the understudies and so on, who went on up and down the country to save shows on a daily basis. It was also great to celebrate that success and to celebrate the covers and understudies and so on at the UK Pantomime Association Awards earlier this year. This is a brand new organisation, of course, the UK Pantomime Association, and of course you are a trustee, Rob, aren't you? So just tell us how all that came about.
I'm really honoured to be one of the trustees. Obviously this came out and built out of the Great British Pantomime Awards, which I was very much aware of. I'd been speaking to Sam Monday Webb in its previous iteration around becoming involved in some way, and we couldn't quite find what that vehicle might be. And during the pandemic, the focus shifted. So the Great British Pantomime Awards, the spirit of that went into what's now the UK Pantomime Awards as part of this charitable organisation called the UK Pantomime Association. So I knew Sam from before. I also knew Simon Sladen, who's the chair, who you've spoken to a couple of times here on this series, Martin, through his work at the V&A Museum, through the Pantomime Archives there, and I was invited to come forward to be one of the trustees. And I'm absolutely delighted. We've got a great range of trustees there. Susan McKenna, who's a very well-known director and pantomime practitioner. We've got Chris Jarvis and Laura Taylor from Imagine as well. But we've also got people who's not necessarily involved in the industries as well. We've got treasurers and so on who've come from different backgrounds in finance. So it was decided that a trustee association, a charitable association, would be an umbrella to really champion the pantomime genre. And so the Pantomime Awards are part of that. And as you say, we really celebrated a lot of the unsung heroes. We wanted to make sure we were singing about those heroes, those swings, those understudies, those creative teams who went back on. That was part of the brief this year, because we want to champion and celebrate. They're part of our charitable aims. We are recognised as a charity with a governing body and so on. So the UK Pantomime Association was born out of the Great British Pantomime Awards, but now it's much bolder and broader than that. So we'll still have the award season every year, celebrating and championing best practice and excellence. But we're also looking forward to how we can be a hub for pantomime practice and be a catalyst for support within the industry as well. And hopefully our final aim is about inspiration. We can then inspire through workshops. We're thinking of doing things such as a kind of a panto-con, a bit like comic cons, so much more kind of broader based activities and workshops and activity that people can get involved with. So I'm absolutely delighted to be part of the UK Pantomime Association.
And it was such a great event as well, wasn't it, to get back together again, with like-minded people, practitioners from various companies all over the country, all coming together like one big family, which is what effectively it is.
It is. Panto as a genre is a family genre, isn't it? It's not I think I said in the previous podcast, it's not just for children, it is a family genre, and extending that, so that's from our audiences, but extending that, the whole of the Pantoland team, as it were, doesn't matter which company that you work for, subsidised, commercial, independent, doesn't matter whether you're a creative artist, a technician, a cast member, doesn't matter where you sit within that landscape, the Panto Awards brings everyone together. We do want to celebrate. We're all working at that time of year. We all work incredibly hard throughout the year, working to the next season. And this is a chance to be able to say this genre is worth celebrating. It brings in so much to the kind of the social worth of the fabric of the UK theatre scene in terms of how people feel as a result of coming to see the pantomime every year and how families want to come and see that work. It brings in so much economically. We should be absolutely celebrating what is one of the UK's best known exports, as it were. Shakespeare and pantomime and Alan Ayckbourn, they all go hand in hand. That's what we're known for around the world. So these awards are the kind of the cherry on the top and the real public facing side of the Pantomime Association.
Now, one of the things that COVID-19 showed us is that we are adaptable and flexible. We've spoken about that already. I spoke to Simon Sladen on an episode recently where we discussed the history of Panto, how we got to where we are today, how it's continually evolved and how it will continue to evolve in the future. That's a conversation that has to be had on every level, not least in academia. And I didn't mention at the very beginning, but you're also the head of Department of Media and Performance at Staffordshire University and Associate Professor in Acting and Directing. And you've launched a brand new MA in the last 12 months on contemporary pantomime practice. That's a perfect place, isn't it, to look to the future and to discuss it openly?
Yeah, this has been bubbling away for a few years now. We've got some brilliant MAs in this country in terms of directing, producing and so on. We wanted at Staffordshire, another colleague of mine, Richard Cheshire, is a specialist in pantomime as well. And it's very rare to have a couple of pantomime specialists working in the same academic institution. And we've been really aware, as have various people in the industry over many years, saying how do we pass on skills and knowledge? How do we ensure that we make this genre legitimate in terms of a subject area? And that's been happening, to be fair, over the last 10 to 15 years, more and more so. Pantomime's often been researched in what's called, under sometimes the umbrella of popular theatre, in academia, and we've spoken about other people like Millie Taylor and so on, who have absolutely researched and published in pantomime, and Simon Sladen's another one of those academics who've done so. So over the last 15 to 20 years, there's been much more of a sense that pantomime should be seen as something that we should be able to study. And we took all of that information and started to shape what would a master's in pantomime look like? What else would it need? Would employers take it seriously? Is it something that the industry needs? And we've been developing that over a couple of years. Last November, before we went into the last Panto season, we did a couple of round tables to help us shape the master's pantomime practice in London, at our Here East campus, which incidentally is by the new V&A, which has obviously got all the pantomime archives within. On one of the round tables, we brought together all the what we're calling the commercial pantomime producers. So we had UK Productions, Evolution, Imagine, and various others. And we did a second round table, which was on more subsidised independent creatives and more independent producers and independent practitioners, and we brought them together and we did two round tables talking about the current landscape of pantomime and how this Masters in Pantomime might help shape that next chapter, but also do some reflection to also support and help industry. How can industry help the pantomime MA? So can people go on placements and so on and so forth? And we had a couple of hours on each round table. The aim is to bring all of those people together at some point in the next 12 months to report back and to build out from there. And that really helped us to shape and formalise the MA structure, what goes into the MA, and where we might go next with the MA.
So interesting times ahead, because the first cohort of students are now in place, and it's going to be interesting to see where their research takes them, isn't it?
Absolutely. We've got our first cohort that will start with us in September, and they're a real range, Martin. We've got people who've graduated from musical theatre degrees. We've got also a septuagenarian who's just really interested all of her life in pantomime and wants to come and study and practice pantomime, and people in between, people who are doing career changes as well. So there's a real range of people on the course.
I guess they can look into any aspect of pantomime practice that they choose. They could look at the work of the director, they could look at any of the creatives, they could even look at script structure and, how pantomime stories may change in the future. Basically, they can bring to the table their own ideas.
They can do any of that and more. So it's built around kind of 4 really simple modules, as it were. One is looking at pantomime, the history of pantomime, but then looking at contemporary manifestations of pantomime. So they've got a real understanding of the genre, as it were. Then they've got a module all about pantomime in action, and they're doing practice-based research. They might look at it through the lens of a director, a writer, a designer, choreographer, and really start to think about those routines, those skills that you need. And eventually this is all leading up through a placement in industry, and they may be an assistant or an observer in subsidised or commercial sectors, shadowing directors. They may be an actor who wants to then move, and they've been a comic who wants to become a dame. If they're doing this MA, they may have a mentor. They'll have an industry mentor supporting them on that journey. And then this all builds up to them writing and performing for a target audience their own pantomime, taking all of that learning over the entire year and constructing, writing, directing, designing their own new pantomime for an audience, taking a story that not necessarily one of the top 5 or 6, as it were, your Dick Whittingtons, Aladdins, Cinderellas, but taking a story that's maybe come from that folk or fairy tale world and taking that into a pantomime structure and putting all of this into practice. Maybe going back to what you were saying earlier, they may take older routines and say, okay, how are these structured? How do you take the core structure of these routines? What does it mean if we want to then create our own routine? Because there's tried and tested means in pantomime. So it's not about reinventing the wheel. It's about researching in terms of what works, what doesn't work as well, and then potentially saying, this is how I'm going to take this forward. We're also looking at it all through different lenses. So what does it mean? People bandy around the idea, oh, it wasn't a traditional pantomime. Well, what actually does that mean? Where's that come from? What do we mean by traditional? Are we talking about the Victorian tradition? Are we talking about traditional because of a memory of, say, the 60s and 70s with the pop stars? Where's that come from? And what does that mean for us now, particularly in relation to audience expectations of panto? So whilst it's got kind of a master's level set of research, we're going to use a lot of practices research, but it's not a high, what I call kind of capital letter academic MA. It's got a lot of practice in there, reflecting on practice, using your own practice. And what's interesting as a result of this MA, and I really hope that this gathers a pace, we've had a couple of inquiries for people from industry and academics as well who want to do like their PhD now and do their PhD in pantomime. And I'm thinking, isn't that absolutely wonderful? Because there are very few people who've done their PhD in pantomime. People have, but actually if we've got a department that can be a hub for this and we can share practical knowledge as well as academic knowledge, and that's really important. We're not sitting in a room in a dusty library studying the history of pantomime. We're going to be in studios, looking in archives, but all that archival stuff will be in studios, writing our own work, battling, discussing, coming up with ideas and recommendations for some of those tricky questions that we've got at the moment around pantomime and ethics and approaches to pantomime and casting and so on. And hopefully that'll inform the industry. But if people want to take that on and do a PhD and be doctors in pantomime, that would be absolutely wonderful.
Totally agree. I think from my point of view, there is no such thing as a traditional pantomime. There are traditional elements, not all of which will you find in each and every pantomime. And generally speaking, I think people, when they talk about a traditional pantomime, they talk about the ones that they remember. I also think that, when you talk about the future of pantomime, it's a risk to make changes. Producers, at the end of the day, have to balance the books and so may not take massive risks. In a project like this, your students can take as many risks as they like. And I'm talking about specific things like, let's bring a completely brand new contemporary story and make it into a pantomime. You would very rarely see that happen in a professional theatre because people with panto like what they know. That's why Cinderella and Aladdin always sell, and taking a risk on some totally brand new pantomime is not something that can be done easily, is it?
It's not, and there are a load of expectations, and I absolutely agree with you. So picking some of that apart, Martin, the first thing you said there, I agree with you on tradition. What makes something traditional in that way? And often it's a memory or an idea about pantomime in some way. I spoke in the last podcast around these notions of ingredients. You can have all these kind of key ingredients, but you can adapt them, put more in, take some out. It will still be a pantomime. And we spoke in the last one around, actually, you can take the Dame role out and it will still be a pantomime because the majority of the ingredients of panto are still in there. But yeah, this gives us an opportunity within a safe space such as an education environment to really test the boundaries, to see how far we can push it. Because there is a frame, when you get to the edge of the frame, it's related to those ingredients we talked about, and you go too far outside of that frame, then it's not a pantomime, then it won't sell. You have to balance the books. You do, as a commercial producer and in the subsidised sector, even if you have if you're doing something through a portfolio organisation and it got subsidised money, it still needs to sell. You still need to have bums on seats. So this also gives an opportunity to take really radical risks. Now, they may ping back, but you may take the spirit of something back into the industry and it will push it out potentially in a smaller way, but it will evolve it in an incremental, tiny way. And that's the joy of being able to test something out in an educational or training environment. You can take those bolder risks. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There is an expectation of what a pantomime is. If audiences don't necessarily get that, they might not come back. So yeah, you've got to balance that, but you can take the spirit of a lot of these explorations back into a professional rehearsal room, if not the actual letter of what you've explored.
Now, you're very much in demand both as a practitioner and as an academic. The book Inside the Rehearsal Room came out earlier this year, published by Bloomsbury. You must be delighted to see that out there now. I mean, it probably got delayed because of COVID, maybe, did it?
It did. There were a couple of delays, and I had to delay it once as well because I was so busy kind of in emergency mode in my university work. I just had to kind of delay by 6 months. But what it gave me a chance to do as well was to do a little bit of a reflection, and there's a coda at the end of the book on, and I was able to reach back out to all the people that I'd spoken to, because a lot of interviews woven into the book, from Rufus Norris to Eva Van Hove and directors, designers, producers. I got Steve Bowden from Imagine provided an interview for the book as well from a producing side. But I was able to reach back out to a lot of people and ask them what it means to be in a rehearsal room in the middle of a pandemic. And there were a couple of people who came back and said, yes, it's been tough, but we've been able to look at different ways of making theatre. And one person replied saying, and they were educating Rita, that famous Willie Russell's two-hander. But they were talking about we couldn't go close to each other very often. This was in the first break, so that July, August 2020. And they were coming back to me and saying things like, it's made me think in rehearsal rooms about space and space between characters and space between actors, that actually, when we do get close, we really need to get close to each other and justify that moment, because they started from a place where not being able to get close to each other in the rehearsal room too much. And it actually helped with the storytelling. So when do they become really close? Let's not take that for granted. I don't walk up to people and get into their really close, immediate space day to day in the street. But on stage, often that happens. So one director came back and said, it's really made me rethink about space and the relationship. The book was, the majority of it was written pre-COVID, looking at, how you might structure a rehearsal room, what's the director-actor relationship, how do they work with text, how do you break through in rehearsal rooms, make those wonderful kind of aha moments, eureka moments, how do those come about, and so on. But yeah, the COVID, the delay actually allowed me to go back out and talk to people about what's important now in theatre and what are the next chapters.
As well as all that, you've contributed to the Routledge Companion to Audiences and the Performing Arts, which looks effectively and explores that relationship between audiences and performers in all sorts of areas. You may look at theatre, dance, opera, music, whatever, but no better clarification of that relationship for me between an audience and a performer than in pantomime.
Oh yes, we often say that, don't we, that the final character in the pantomime is the audience member. That audience, those audiences take the story forward, crying out with Snow White and the apple, making Tinkerbell, come back to life again in Peter Pan. They're actively kind of moving the story forward, but they're joining in. They've got all those routines that they know, the call-outs that they know, and so on. The interaction, sometimes if there's a stooge on stage, the song sheet, the audience is absolutely integral. There was a call-out for the Routledge Companion. I thought, I'm going to write something about pantomime in there and the importance of audiences in pantomime. Dawn Lucock wrote something about this in 2003, but there's been a bit of a gap in that. There's been obviously pockets in various books. It's definitely in the It's Behind You book about the audience and Millie Taylor's book and so on. But I was really interested in going back out. I was talking to people like Gary Wilmot and Brian Connolly and practitioners as well, and what their understanding and feeling is about the actor-audience relationship in panto. I wanted to just write about this. I do it every year at Christmas. I say it to the cast, let the audiences in. When you ask them a question, everything from hello boys and girls or which way did they go, genuinely listen to them. Don't just assume that they're going to say yes or that way or morning. Genuinely have a dialogue, just as you would with another actor on stage. Sometimes I go and see pantos and they kind of drive through the response, but you really have to let them in as if they were another actor and have a genuine call and response rather than just riding over it and getting to the next bit. And it's really interesting that Brian Connolly was saying that for him, he says, and I quote, that the audience are going to write it. They decide what's funny or not. So he talks around, you can put something together, but you listen to that audience in those first few shows, and if it doesn't work, stop going on with it. He says the audience will decide fundamentally. So obviously he's coming at that from the role of the comic, and there's different areas of that. But again, this whole idea that the audience are going to write it with you, that takes it even one step further, doesn't it, I think, in terms of they're not literally in a room with the writer doing that beforehand, but they're writing it with you in that moment. So genuinely be with your audience, let them in, hear them, listen to them, respond to them, and make sure that the audience know that when Tinkerbell comes back to life in Peter Pan, they have done that work. They've done it. They've been responsible for that.
I think it's at its very best pantomime when the audience and the cast are in complete sync. And that means not just shouting out when they have to or singing along when they have to, but you get that audience that will give a running commentary of what's going on the stage.
Yes.
No, don't give him the lamp, all that sort of stuff. That's absolutely perfect panto for me. And with that in mind, I think it'd be a nice point to end on. Whether or not you agree with me, we talked about traditional pantomime, and there are lots of elements, whether that be a dame or a principal boy or slapstick or a song sheet or whatever. For me, all of those are interchangeable. You've said before the ingredients can be changed. As long as you've got most of the ingredients, that will still work as a pantomime. For me, the one element or ingredient that you must have at all costs is that interaction and that relationship with the audience. Would you agree?
I totally agree. And actually, I'm going to rethink my ingredients list as a result of writing this article. And when we spoke before, my thinking's always changing. But yeah, I completely agree. And how interesting, when we've had the digital pantomimes in lockdown, so Peter Duncan's pantomime and Panto Live, and what they were trying to do through that was find ways to connect with the audience. That was very simply talking to camera at times, as we would do. But then the people, some have explored that interaction on the cheering and when they come in. I went to see a car park panto when I didn't direct panto in 2020. I went to see a car park panto, and the interaction there. We were in our bubbles of our cars, but we were popping our horns when the baddie came on. We were flashing our lights. We were, so we all have always needed, even in that digital environment or even in the car park pantos, we've always found ways to connect with the action on stage. Take that away, and that is certainly not a pantomime in my book.
Well, it's been a pleasure catching up with you again. I would imagine, like everybody else, you're really excited about the forthcoming season.
I am. I'm back at Halifax with Imagine, undertaking Sleeping Beauty. We had a production meeting on Monday, which was great. Myself and Eric were up at the venue with the theatre technicians there, and we were hybrid with the team down in Coventry as well, preparing. Eric and I have been putting the finishing touches on the script. Eric's writing and associate producer, so we've been working really closely on the script. We're in the middle of choosing music finalising creative team and cast. And again, just working forward, always thinking forward to the next season and what we're going to offer our Halifax audiences this year, what they've come to expect, as we were talking about earlier, what new elements we might want to pepper in.
Exciting times. Pleasure to catch up with you again. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you, Martin.
And I'm afraid that's about it for another episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the series to catch up with any episodes you've missed so far, and make sure you don't miss out in the future. And make sure you join me next time on Just Imagine, when we'll begin our tour of Imagine Theatre pantos across the UK, talking to casts and creatives as we count down to the Christmas season 2022. I'll see you then.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.